Welcome back, AP. This is Chapter 11. In this chapter, we'll focus on the time period from 1800 to 1812. Some of the key terms that you need to know that coincide with the chapter, and some of the people to know. This chapter of American Pageant is related to Key Concept 4.1. And once you have finished watching this video and taking the notes, head on over to my website and watch the review video for Key Concept 4.1. The Federalists die hard. The Federalist Party controlled the Congress, but since the newly elected Congress was now Republican, there's this time period known as the lame duck period, where the party that is leaving office really has very minimal power as the new party is coming in. However, even though there was this lame duck period, Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. President Adams was a Federalist, and as he is leaving office to make way for the newly elected President Jefferson, he decides to appoint a bunch of Federalist judges to the judiciary branch in order to keep some of the Federalist power in the federal government. And he does this on his last day of office. It's known as the Midnight Appointments, and this action results in the Supreme Court case known as Marbury versus Madison, which we'll address in future slides. As Jefferson takes his role as the new president, he is the third president of the United States. The transfer of power between one party to the other was relatively peaceful, considering all of the mudslinging and the bitterness that took place during the campaign between Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson made few changes. Those changes that he did make were to slowly kind of transfer the power between the Federalist and the Democratic Republican Party. He did repeal the excise tax, and he turned the Treasury over to Albert Gallatin, who wanted to balance the budget. He did not believe in debt, as Alexander Hamilton did. The new capital, the newly founded national capital, is the city of Washington, D.C. Jefferson stayed at the presidential mansion, and the Capitol was at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue upon what is known as Capitol Hill. Some things that took place during Jefferson's administration. Jefferson abolished all internal taxes, and government spending was cut to minuscule levels. So he decreases the national debt from 83 to 45 million because of the cut in government spending. He scaled down on the Army and the Navy, but even though he was scaling down on the military, he did establish West Point in 1802, which is a military academy. Jefferson was forced to build up the Navy after the Marbury Pirates incident, and they were requiring payment. In 1805, the U.S. and Tripoli reached an agreement to end payments of tribute. However, they did pay $60,000 ransom to release American prisoners. Now, going back to the conflict with the courts, and because of the midnight appointments that Adams conducted on his way out of office, the Republicans had control of two of the branches. They had the presidential portion, or the executive branch, and then they had the legislative branch, or the lawmaking branch. So now they wanted to go after the judicial branch. Legislation was passed to repeal the Judiciary Act of 1801, and the Federalists maintained that the Supreme Court had the authority to nullify acts of Congress, but the courts hadn't declared a law unconstitutional. This is going to eventually establish judicial review, in which the judicial branch has the final say on whether or not a law is constitutional. The Supreme Court of Marbury versus Madison. William Marbury was one of the midnight appointments, and he failed to receive his commission, and Secretary of State James Madison refused to hand over the commission, so that's why Marbury didn't receive it. The court ruled that Marbury had the right to the commission, but they also ruled that Madison didn't have to deliver it. So what's the real effect of Marbury versus Madison? The court declared that the Judiciary Act of 1789 expanded the court's power by making the executive officials deliver commissions. By denying its own authority, Madison declared that the act was unconstitutional, defining the Supreme Court's place as the interpreter of the Constitution. So the real effect of Marbury versus Madison is that it now has the power of judicial review, which is to determine whether or not a law is constitutional. And this will be something that you need to really pay attention to as we discuss some of the Supreme Court cases of the Marshall Court. The impeachment of Samuel Chase. Jefferson targeted Judiciary Federalists, threatening to stop his policies. Congress proposed that judges can be impeached for obstructing the other branches of government. And impeachment means that they are removed from office. Samuel Chase was tried, but Republicans could not get the 2/3 vote of the Senate, and this also helped to establish that impeachment could not be used as a political weapon. So just because you wanted to remove a judge that is not agreeing with policies of the executive branch, it's not something that they could just, it's not a weapon they could just wield in order to get what they want. The Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul in France in 1801, and then he named himself emperor in 1804. Napoleon gave up on his dreams of a French empire in the New World. Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million, or 3 cents an acre. And the United States didn't set out to purchase all of that territory. They really wanted to acquire New Orleans, and they were prepared to offer $10 million for New Orleans. And then Napoleon turns around and offers them the entire territory for $15 million. With the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, the United States doubled in size. So you can see that this is the area, the boundary of the United States prior to the Louisiana Purchase, and this is the territory that the U.S. gained from the Louisiana Purchase. Now, because of all this new territory, the federal government needed to have someone explore, and Lewis and Clark were sent on their expedition to explore the Louisiana Territory and the westward areas. They left from St. Louis, and they were led by an Indian guide named Sacagawea. They headed up the Missouri River, over the Rocky Mountains, and down the Snake and Columbian Rivers until they reached the Pacific Ocean on the western part of the continent. This highlights the trail that Lewis and Clark took on their westward exploration of the Louisiana Territory and then the Oregon Territory. The Burr Conspiracy. As the West grew, the less power Federalists would retain. The most extreme Federalist was a group known as Essex Gento, and they called for secession from the Union into a Northern Confederacy. And Alexander Hamilton refused to support this succession from the Union. Federalists supported Aaron Burr for governor of New York, and Jefferson was still mad at him and Hamilton and accused him of supporting the Essex Gento's plan of succession. Hamilton versus Burr. After Burr loses in New York, he blames Hamilton and challenges him to a duel. Hamilton, being considering it a gentleman's challenge, accepted. And July 11th, 1804, in Weehawken, New Jersey, Hamilton was mortally wounded as a result of the duel and died the next day. As a result of threats of trying to conspire to secede from the nation and taking part in the duel that kills Alexander Hamilton, Burr becomes a political outcast. He moves west, where he leads a group of armed men down the Ohio River in an attempt to secede the Trans-Mississippi West, where he fails again. He was arrested, but he was acquitted of treason, and he ends up going back to New York and practicing law. America's predicament at sea. After 1805, Napoleon blockaded Europe against British trade because Britain and France were warring with one another. Britain decreed it would capture any ships bound for European ports. American ships were stopped by both countries, and non-natives were impressed into the British Navy. And that means they were taken from the ships and forced into the British military. With the Chesapeake Leopold incident, Americans wanted war. Jefferson was able to pass the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically cut off all trade with countries that were at war. It was designed to punish Britain and France, but it ends up harming the American economy more than anything. And as a result of the embargo of 1807, America goes into a severe depression. In 1808, after Jefferson had served his 2 terms, James Madison is elected, but the Federalists gained support because of Jefferson's embargo. Jefferson ended the embargo before he left office. He tried to replace the embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act, which reopened all trade with other nations except for Britain and France, and then that was dwindled down in Congress and replaced a year later with Macon's Bill number 2, which opened trade, but the president had the power to establish an embargo if foreign countries continued to oppress American citizens. The Native American problem. In 1801, Jefferson appointed William Henry Harrison as governor over the Indiana Territory. The Indian policy was movement west or assimilation into white society. And assimilation means they basically adapt to white society and they take on what are considered the white roles. 2 Native Americans inspired Indian spiritual awakenings against the evil of the white culture. I know I'm going to butcher his name, Tenskwata, or he was also known as the Prophet, and Tecumseh tried to unite the Indians against the whites in the Mississippi Valley. In order to become more powerful, natives began trying to establish some sort of alliance. In November of 1811, Tecumseh left Prophetstown to recruit natives, and Governor Harrison attacked with 1,000 soldiers and drove off the natives and burned the town. And this is known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. And pay attention to this in future chapters when William Henry Harrison runs for president. Tecumseh and his followers allied with the British, so the British began to arm the natives. And Americans like Harrison wanted to oust the British from Canada and stop them from encouraging native attacks across the Canadian-American border. Problems with Florida. Florida belongs to Spain or the Spanish Empire, and some of the problems with Florida is that slaves were escaping into the Florida controlled by the Spanish, and so once they escaped there, they were free. Natives were attacking across the border, and then Spain was an ally of Great Britain. In 1810, American settlers seized a Spanish fort in Baton Rouge and asked the federal government to annex the territory. Madison agreed, and then the next step was to try and get the rest of Florida. War hawks are those who are in favor of war. By the 1812, war fever was growing because of American impressment by the British, because of the British arming Native Americans across the Canadian border and encouraging them to attack Americans. 1810 elections elected representatives eager for war, and those representatives are known as war hawks. And 2 of the dominant men that would fall into that category were Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun.